I'd like to thank you all for joining us. This is our second event in the fall series of the Modern Tibetan Studies program at Columbia University. My name is Lauran Hartley, and I serve as director of the program. It is an honor to welcome our two speakers today, Dominique Townsend and Gyatso, and I welcome our students here who've joined. We are here primarily to learn about Professor Townsend's new book, A Buddhist Sensibility, Aesthetic Education at Tibet's Mindröling Monastery, published in April of this year by Columbia University Press. At the same time, we see this as a rare opportunity to discuss Buddhist aesthetics and Tibetan literary arts more generally. And so we've also invited Gyatso for her expertise to engage these topics with her once student, Dominique Townsend. Gyatso is the Hershey Professor of Buddhist Studies and an Associate Dean at Harvard Divinity School. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2018, served as President of the International Association for Tibetan Studies from 2000 to 2006, and served as co-chair of the Buddhism section of the American Academy of Religion. Professor Gyatso pushes Tibetan studies scholars to raise important theoretical questions and to dialogue with researchers outside our field. Close reading in Tibetan are at the core of all her publications. To highlight just two, her study, Being Human in a Buddhist World, won the Toshihide Numata Award for the best academic book published on Buddhism in 2016. In it, she explores religious and scientific epistemologies in Tibetan medicine during the 16th to 18th centuries, pointing to an empiricism in the very period that Dominique Townsend will discuss today. Janet's apparitions of the self lay the groundwork for new lines of inquiry in the study of life writing in Tibet and beyond. Many of her articles are also go-to works on the presence of image, terma, women in Tibet, gender in medicine, and recently Kavya theory. Without her scholarly and other professional contributions, the fields of Tibetan studies and Buddhist studies would not be what they are today. My sincere thanks to you both. Professor Gyatso will introduce our main speaker. After Professor Townsend's presentation, our two guests will follow with discussion. We will then open it up for questions from our students here at Columbia and from participants online. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Lauran, for such a generous and wonderful introduction. I'm very, very grateful and very honored to have been asked to be here and also very happy to be here. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to see the students in the class at Columbia. So, and I love the view, which we can see everybody sitting there. So it's fantastic. And I'm also so glad to be on a panel with Dominique Townsend. Yes, Lauran said my ex-student, but in many ways my friend as well. So, and I'm her student as well in many ways. Anyway, it's great to be here today, and I know that there's other participants, and you know, just during this time of the pandemic and using a lot of virtual technology, it's amazing. It's one of the few silver linings on an otherwise very terrible situation that many of us are able to see each other in many more contexts than and not requiring a lot of travel, which may be the way of our future in general. But I do hope that sometimes we will be able to get back in person together. But anyway, yes, Dominique was actually officially my student at the Harvard Divinity School. She was a master's student there. So she spent 2 years there in all of my classes on Buddhism and Tibetan studies, and then went on to the doctoral program, your excellent doctoral program at Columbia in Tibetan studies. And I did remain, you know, part of, I was a conversation partner of her, but eventually I was on her committee or at some point for her doctoral dissertation, which is what led to this wonderful book. And now Dominique has a great job at Bard College, where she is assistant professor of Buddhist studies. Soon to be promoted. And she's come out with a really, I think, very important book, the book that we're going to be talking about today, A Buddhist Sensibility, aesthetic education at Tibet's Mindröling Monastery. And it's a wonderful book to have, and there's amazing illustrations in it, which are part of the demonstration of the artistic excellence, level of artistic excellence at Mindröling. And I know she's going to be talking about some of them today, but it would be wonderful if we could have like an online website of like all of these in color and to be able to see them. Some really, really beautiful, fantastic images. And it all speaks to the really interesting nature and legacy of Mindröling Monastery as a place where the arts, both the literary arts and the visual arts and the material arts of various kinds, were really propagated alongside each other and not in contradiction with each other at Mindröling. So it's a really fascinating case study of the role of the arts in Buddhism. And the role of the arts in Buddhism has a long history in which it's controversial, and it goes two ways. In some ways, there's a hesitancy or a reluctance on Buddhism, on the part of Buddhist doctrine or Buddhist practice, to value artistic expression. But at the very same time, there is a huge amount of interest in using artful expression for the creation and propagation of Buddhist teachings. And this is like a larger theme that many people in Buddhist studies are looking at these days. So Dominique book really contributes to this very larger and really interesting, complicated conversation. So I'm really looking forward to her talk. She's going to talk for some time now about the book, and then we'll have some questions, and we can also take your questions as well. So thank you again, and my pleasure to introduce Dominique.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I'm thrilled to be here together, in a sense, together. I love looking at, though I can't see the faces of our attendees, virtual attendees, it's such an honor to see the names coming in, and I'm so grateful to everyone for joining us. So I will start with some images and just a sort of introduction to Mindröling as an institution, and to the book, and hopefully there will be something for everyone in here. So some visual images, as well as a few quotes from the wonderful thinkers and authors whose work this book is based on. So, and also I'd like to thank Lauran Hartley, especially for organizing this and for inviting Janet and me, and to the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, and also to the Star Library for supporting this event. So thank you. Okay, so Mindröling Monastery. This is an image of the monastery, the exterior of the monastery from within the courtyard, taken in 2007 by Lee Miller, who I think may be here with us. Thank you. I have lots of photos from friends and colleagues from over the years who have traveled to Mindröling. So here's a wonderful shot of the exterior of the monastery. So Mindröling Monastery was founded officially in 1676. It was under construction for some time before that, but 1676 is the date that the construction was finished and that Terdak Lingpa, the main founder of the monastery, was enthroned. So Terdak Lingpa is a fascinating figure. He's most famous as a visionary, or a terton, right, a treasure discoverer, with deep ties to the tradition of Padmasambhava from the 8th century. Here's an image, a wonderful image of Terdak Lingpa. I'm actually the cover of the book as well. This is in the collection of the Rubin Museum. If you're in New York City, I hope sometime you'll have a chance to visit there, and also perhaps if you're lucky to see this wonderful image of Terdak Lingpa. So he's also known as a scholar, from spending lots of time with his work. I can tell you he was a wonderful poet, a historian, someone who was deeply, deeply committed to codifying and clarifying the traditions of his own Nyingma School. But the way that he did that was largely through engaging with, both through teacher-student relationships and through sharing scholarly exchanges with teachers from across the Buddhist schools. So that's something that we'll talk about in the course of thinking about Mindröling's history. So he was also of course, a member of the old school or ancient school of Tibetan Buddhism. As I mentioned, this is actually a photo that Janet shared with me of a painting that's sort of just as you're moving through that courtyard we just looked at, entering into the main shrine room. It's actually a wonderful painting which is attributed to one of the other main founding figures of Mindröling, a great artist called Luchin Dharmasri, who will also talk more about. I actually sort of love the various reflections of the other people in the room that you get because of it's behind glass. So a little bit hard to see, but gives you a sense of the space as well. So Terdek Lingpa is also one of the significant things about his identity that we'll want to keep in mind for understanding how Mindröling came to be Mindröling, was that he was a member of an aristocratic clan, the Nyo clan. He was also, his mother, this was on his father's side, the Nyo clan. On his mother's side, there were ties to the Tibetan imperial family. So a really, a very august family line, really coming from both directions. This is an image that's from the 13th century, a portrait of a member of the Nyo clan, right? So this is an unidentified historical figure, but the painting is marked as being of this clan. And the reason I want to look back to these earlier figures is that one of the ways that Mindröling came to occupy the particular space that it did in early modern Tibet is through a sort of elegant integration and balance of different types of authority. And in particular, to sort of boil it down, we could say Buddhist authority and political authority. And so, you know, how did they come to do this? How did they know how to do this? How did they integrate this so relatively elegantly at Mindröling? One of my sort of, you know, main arguments about the family at the center of Mindröling, because it was a family lineage, it is a family lineage, is that in part this was just the way their family was, right? They were a member of the aristocratic class, and for centuries, members of this family had been lamas who were also landholders and had political authority. And so in the early modern period, when the fifth Dalai Lama and his advisors were working so hard to establish a unified Tibetan area that was governed from Lhasa, and in which the Dalai Lama held these two types of authority, as he was looking for ways, for models for how to do that, I think he looked directly to the founders of Mindröling in that regard. So this is, again, a much longer lineage than just Terdek Lingpa and his immediate family members, but really stretched back for many generations in their family. So the main sponsor of the monastery was the fifth Dalai Lama himself. He was very, very intimately involved in all of the decisions about the particular location of the monastery, how they would name the monastery, the dates on which important points of construction would be completed. You know, he even, in certain documents, it seems that he even arranged personally for certain woodworkers and artisans to travel to Mindröling. So he was very intimately involved. And now, if you're you know, familiar with the schools of Tibetan Buddhism, you'll know that, of course, the Dalai Lama is the head of the Gelug school, and during the time that Mindröling was founded, there was quite a lot of intersectarian conflict. And so it's quite interesting in a certain sense that the fifth Dalai Lama would have been so intimately involved with founding a monastery associated with the Nyingma School. And that will, again, be important as we move ahead in the early history of Mindröling. So I love this sculpture. This is in the collection at the Museum of Fine Art in Boston. And part of what I love about it is that if you can look closely here, there's a dagger that he's wearing in his belt. And as far as I'm able to discern, this is actually a dagger. This was constructed around the time of Mindröling's founding as well, this image. This was a dagger that Terdek Lingpa actually gave to the fifth Dalai Lama. So there's a nice sort of material remnant of their personal connection and their connection as teacher and student as well. One of the ways that Mindröling is also known, and one of the areas of expertise that Therak Lingpa held, was in the great perfection practices. And so I wanted to show this image. This is, of course, the Tibetan letter A. This is from a set of 18th century empowerment cards. And one of the types of expertise, particular types of expertise that Mindröling became known for through Therak Lingpa's influence was in the teaching and practice of Dzogchen. And in particular, a particular area of interest for me actually is in dream yoga, which will figure into the story as we move along. So one of the other important factors to think about as we I'm trying to set the stage for how Mindröling came to occupy its particular role. As I began this research as a graduate student, in some ways I moved through these stages of interest. First I was actually curious about dream yoga. That was one of my first interests that drew me to Mindröling. And I learned early on that the just previously deceased throne holder at Mindröling was famous for these types of practices. And so, with that, I was led into looking at Mindröling more broadly. The next interest of mine was actually in the women teachers that Mindröling is known for. And so one of those first key figures was actually Therak Lingpa's mother. And this is just the front cover of her biography, which was composed by Therak Lingpa's younger brother. But she was a very, very important figure in Therak Lingpa's life as a visionary and his career. And I think that in many ways, looking back to her can help us understand the really significant role that women came to play at Mindröling, which again is one of its other distinguishing features. So she's a fascinating character. Another of the women that I came to learn about as I began to pull out these threads of Mindröling's fascinating early history in the late 1600s was the presence of Therak Lingpa's daughter, pictured here, Mingyur Peldren. She was a nun, and she became a very, very significant figure in the transmission of Therak Lingpa's teachings to, especially to her younger brother, at a period of crisis in Mindröling's early history. So here we have again evidence, visual, artistic evidence of the very, very significant presence of women in this tradition, which is one of the other ways that it caught my attention and one of the ways that it's outstanding in the Tibetan field. So among the, when I first started to research Mindröling, I was very, very focused on Therak Lingpa. He's a fascinating character, of course, in many ways, a highly charismatic figure. When you read accounts of people meeting Therak Lingpa, they're full of devotion, they're full of, affective response, their hair stands on end, tears come to their eyes. There's all these descriptions of Therak Lingpa, the main founder, as incredibly beautiful, glowing. And for many years, I was mostly focused on him, with interest in the women as well, but I was really focused on him. And I have to say, especially in the latter years of finishing this book project, I became more and more interested in his younger brother, Lochen Dharmashri. And in certain ways, the tradition itself of Mindröling's history seeks to put this figure of Lochen Dharmashri, the monk scholar, a little bit in the background from Therak Lingpa, who is the charismatic Lama at the center of the institution. But little by little, I came to see more and more clues of just how important Lochen Dharmashri was, especially in regard to literary arts and visual arts. As I've said before, some of the wonderful paintings in Mindröling's main seat in Tibet, in central Tibet, are attributed to Lochen Dharmashri. So we'll look at a couple of those as we go. So this is one more of the main figures of this early history of Mindröling. Here I wanted to turn now to think about the other, one of the other main kind of portions of the population of Mindröling, of course, is the monks. So Mindröling, in many ways, for being such an influential and prestigious institution as it came to be, was remarkably small. You know, it seems from all the documents that I've spent time with that it was really designed with the intention that it would be relatively small and that there would be about 300 monks at most. And it seems like at its peaks, there were 330 monks. So this is an image from 2009 from the interior of the main shrine room. And you can see in the background here a sculpture of Terdak Lingpa, always identifiable, or often identifiable by this beard, except for in images where he's very young. But this will also give you a sense of the kind of visual space of the monastery itself. So with this identity of Mindröling as a Nyingma monastery, very much focused on cultivating the ritual arts. And so what we want to think about when we think about those arts, it's really all senses, right? And this is actually what brought me to, in my long period of research, what brought me to thinking about aesthetic education as a kind of one useful lens through which to view the history of Mindröling, right? Not by any means the only useful lens, but one useful lens was really what came to be a sort of fascination with the way that Mindröling practices cultivate the senses and all of the senses, right? So Mindröling is known, famous for its incense, right? Mindröling is famous for its musical liturgies. Mindröling is also very well known for some of its visual artistic traditions, you know, making torma, mandala making. Actually, early on, Lochen Dharmashri developed a wonderful practice of using the incense as a sort of mold, right? So you could make a clay, what looks like a clay sculpture, but out of the incense. So if you start to think about this array of practices, we can see that really all of the senses are being cultivated and worked with through these ritual practices that Mindröling founders worked so hard to crystallize and clarify and codify at Mindröling. And so as I sort of spent time with these various types of sources, you know, I looked at letters between the founder and fifth Dalai Lama and other significant political and religious figures. I looked at the histories of the monastery. I looked, you know, some of which were written in the early period, in the late 17th, early 18th century, some of which were written in the 20th century. I looked at, of course, the sort of monastic guidelines for the monastery. I looked at all sorts of examples of ritual texts and poetry. And the particular sort of method that I took as I became more and more interested in the ways that Mindröling traditions focused on the senses was this framework of aesthetics. And in some sense, what drove my my research, or the way that I sort of, you know, focused my efforts, was to ask of these different kinds of sources, you know, what is the importance of beauty here? You know, does it matter? What's the importance of the senses? Where are the senses in these, in letters, in histories, in guidelines? You know, are they significant? Are they important? And more, I was convinced that yes, indeed they are. But then, you know, of course, then the next step is to think about why and how particularly are they working in shaping this, the early identity of Mindröling. The reason that became so important to me was partly to do with, in my early experience of asking about Mindröling, you know, looking at texts on Mindröling, I heard again and again from all manner of people that Mindröling was famous not only for monastic discipline, not only for great perfection practice, not only for women teachers, not only for the sort of clarification of these Nyingma teachings and rituals that then were passed on to other monasteries, right? But also, and this was in some sense a major kind of hinge in my research, but also for educating lay people of the highest echelon of the aristocratic class. So this for me was a real puzzle, right, in my early research. Why would one small monastery that was known for these esoteric practices of great perfection, or dzogchen, that was also curiously marked as being a special place for women teachers, why would this be a place that lay aristocrats, many of whom who would go on to be major literary figures, maybe major political and diplomatic figures, why Mindröling? And in some sense, the answer that I came to and the argument that I make in the book is that the training in aesthetics, the aesthetic education that Mindröling, for various reasons, became such a font of expertise in, was in some sense a kind of bridge or a connection between the types of expertise that one needed to be a Buddhist practitioner and Lama, and the types of expertise that one needed to go on to have a successful career as a lay literary scholar or diplomat or politician. So this is where my focus on the senses kind of came into a really sharp relief. So I think with that, I'll just say a little bit more about the path that I took to get to studying Mindröling. When I was an undergrad, I did a program called the School for International Training. I think many of you are familiar with it, and traveled to India and Nepal and Tibet under the direction of the wonderful Hubert de Clear, just recently passed away in August. And during that time was when I first learned about Mindröling, actually. So this is all the way back in 1997, to date myself. And so, as I've said already, I came across one after the other of these sort of features of Mindröling, which seemed to me to be quite fascinating. And really, this was then over the period of time when I came back and finished my undergraduate degree at Barnard. Then I went and lived in Asia for several years, lived in Nepal, and was incredibly fortunate to be able to travel to Mindröling quite a few times, to be able to get to know some of the monks there, to learn from them about the artistic practices and also the particular images in the monastery. And so little by little, these chapters of my kind of interest in Mindröling came together and began to unfold in this picture, in which I focus on aesthetics as a kind of central kind of theoretical framework. So methodologically, I would say the two main features of my early research were to look at a really diverse range of sources. And I think that it became clear to me that that was necessary because I wanted to get, in some sense, the biggest picture possible of this particular institution, right? And I thought the way to do that was not just looking at biographies or letters or ritual texts or histories, but to see if I could ask these questions about the place of aesthetics across different kinds of genres. I would say that another kind of subtle aspect of the method is simply asking a new kind of question, right? And in some ways, of course, all of our research is really defined by our questions. I say this all the time to my students at Bard, but I think that it never changes, right? That the most important thing for any research project is a good question, right? So this question that I became obsessed with, again, was, is beauty important? Are aesthetics important? And if so, how are they working to define Mindröling? So this was the question that I went in with. I want to mention that when I was doing my research as a graduate student all the way through my doctoral studies, I worked a lot with continental theorists and philosophers, to think with the material of, French thinkers like Bourdieu, like Foucault. And I found this to be extremely helpful in terms of making sense of my own findings, in terms of organizing the way to kind of think with the Tibetan materials. But in the process of revising the book, I think one of the main efforts that I made was in many ways to sort of allow those European and continental thinkers that framework that I had created to sort of recede and really to try to draw out and allow to really emerge as the kind of dominant framework, the theoretical frames that the Tibetan thinkers that I was studying were working with, right? So those main kind of frames were always there for me, but in a certain way, I think I had, I don't know if it was a mistake or just a process, a part of my process, but it was very a kind of profound intellectual experience for me to watch what changed, right? When I allowed one kind of set of theories recede and another one come to the fore. So this was one of the kind of more satisfying and I think important revisions that I made. So some of the main frameworks that I'm thinking about there, I'll just talk about a couple of them in terms of those Tibetan frameworks that I allowed to come to the forefront. One of them is called one of them is the fields of knowledge, right? The Rikne. And this kind of organizing, this set of organizing principles about, what is an education? What does one need to learn to be an educated Buddhist, right? I became really interested in these because this is one of the main draws for lay aristocrats to come to Mindröling, but it was also really a foundation of the education for all of the members of Mindröling, including the monks whose main role would go on to be ritual practice. Still, there's a very strong focus on these fields of knowledge, which are rooted in earlier Indic tradition, but which became really fundamental in the education as it was developed at Mindröling. And so one of the things that I noticed as I spent time with first these 5, what are called the major fields of knowledge, which are dialectics, grammar, medicine, arts, visual arts, and then Buddhism, right? So to notice first and foremost, when we think about what is a Buddhist education in this formal way, the actual sort of study of Buddhist doctrine is a small part of it, right? There are all these other things that one needs to know, it seems, right, based on this model. So these are the 5 major fields, and then there are also 5 minor fields. These are altogether the 10 fields of knowledge. And so Mindröling, again, is known for all of these, for astrology, especially for poetics, for composition, for the study of synonyms, and drama. So as I pored over the texts that sort of, laid out how students at Mindröling should study these fields of knowledge, I became more and more struck by how significant the language arts are, the literary arts are, right? If you sort of look through these, we have poetry, we have composition, we have synonyms. If we look back, we have grammar here. So clearly, language is a really, really important part of what it means to be educated in the Buddhist system, and particularly in the ways that it's adopted at Mindröling. And for that reason, when I started to sort of pour into what was drawing these not just high-powered lay aristocrats, but over time, many really great venerated lamas came to Mindröling, especially, right, to study. And I think that of course, the draw of being a place of expertise in great perfection practice was major, and I'm not diminishing that at all. But I think that in many ways, the focus on the literary arts was one of those kind of key areas of aesthetic education that everybody needed, that in order to be an eloquent and persuasive teacher of Buddhism, to write beautifully, to write verses of praise, to work with language in all the ways that Buddhist teachers need to work with language, we can see that this was a great asset in the Mindröling education. The same, of course, is easy to see when we're talking about lay aristocrats who are going to go on to be major figures in the government as literary figures. And so in that sense, this is just one example of the ways that Mindröling was able to serve different kinds of populations. Again, this was established quite early in its history. I'm thinking about the first sort of 50 years in the book. Another of the main Tibetan theoretical frameworks that I'm foregrounding is the system of that's often called, in Tibetan, it's called lukni or sometimes trimni, and sometimes this is used as a synonym for what's called in Tibetan chusi zungdrel, or the kind of unification or integration of religion and politics, right? And so if I step back again to think about some of those Tibetan theories, Rikne, as I've already mentioned, this idea of the kind of joining of the proper joining of religion and politics, or religion and kind of being in the world. And then finally, the last of these, which I hope we'll have more time to talk about, is the Tibetan theoretical concept or the framework of Rime, which is often translated as non-sectarianism. But what I found in my, sort of this search for signs of aesthetics in the early Mindröling materials was that Rime was treated very centrally in the kind of identity of the monastery, not so much though as non-sectarianism, but really as a kind of expression of an enlightened view that isn't rooted in or kind of obsessed with one particular perspective, right? So again, I see that as a kind of connective work that the concept was doing, that Tibetan concept was doing. And so those are some of the Tibetan frameworks that I've sought to kind of bring to the surface in the book. Okay, so I'm going to stop there in order to make sure that we have some time to talk with Janet, and then to have some time for questions from you all as well. So actually, I do have some more slides to show. Lauran, should I stop share, do you think, and go back to them so that everyone can see us better, or
Dominique? Yeah. Sure, please do. Yeah, why don't you finish up with your slides? That sounds good. Okay. It's only 1:10 now. Yeah, okay.
Okay, no, I think that I will.
You finish up with them, you said.
Yeah, no, I'll stop there. I was just wondering if I should stop my share so that everyone can see us better. I'm not sure how this is showing.
Oh, yeah, that would be good. Thanks. Thank you. So Janet, we see you now. We have the three of us. Thanks. Thank you, Dominique. Let's just flow right into conversation. Janet.
Okay, thank you very much. I was actually going to ask you some things about some of your slides so we could go back to them as we start to talk. But anyway, thanks for the presentation. I can tell the audience that she just scratched the surface of the book. I mean, that was like the overarching structure and rationale, but all the very specific examples within it, it's just a very, very rich and investigation. I mean, and it's hard for me to know where to start because I had a list of prepared questions, but then all the things that you were saying, sort of shifted what I wanted to say. But I wanted to start with the question about why, the big question, why is beauty important? And how is beauty important? And so this is just to step back for a moment. And not only how is beauty important for Mindröling identity per se, but why was beauty a value that was upheld in this particular monastery? And then, I mean, it leads me to say that it feels to me as if, Mindröling was established by the fifth Dalai Lama. The fifth Dalai Lama himself, who was a major sort of revolutionary figure in many kinds of ways in Tibet, and who was very much invested in the importance of the arts. And he himself was a commentator on poetry, extensively, and many other of these arts. And by studying Mindröling, which was a place probably in some ways deliberately established as to impart the kind of Buddhist education that maybe the Dalai Lama was hoping would happen. But it helps us to see that, this focus on the arts is not only something that happened at Mindröling, but the arts are very important in Tibetan Buddhist monasteries more generally, certainly in the creation of Buddhist art. And there's so much art in these monasteries, and they're trading in it, and they're creating, and some monasteries stand out more than others as having like workshops of painters, and also some of them have special cool schools of literature, and some of them also schools in medicine, all of the production of things like Lama dancing and so on. So in some ways, Mindröling, which really specializes kind of brings into focus, and then it actually helps us to understand many of the other monasteries that we see more generally. So Mindröling is kind of like an outstanding example of a pattern that's very true across the board, certainly through Tibetan Buddhism. And it sort of leads me, you know, one of the interesting things, as you mentioned, about Mindröling is that it had this very important lay aristocratic presence, which is not that's actually probably, I think, unusual, at least in Tibet, to have a lot of, you know, lay people studying there, living there, you know, and I don't know if you, you know, one of your chapters is entitled something like Taming the Aristocrats. Why would Buddhist monks be invested in wanting their leaders to be good at art? Why would they want them to be good at composition, to be aesthetically, you know, sort of, you know, expert and connoisseurs of types of artistic production, both visual arts and, let's say, and poetry and literature? You know, so, you know, the bigger question behind it, of course, is, are they, you know, being lax on their own Buddhist education if they're emphasizing, you know, the arts? On the other hand, is this something intentional? Is there a way in which it's actually a vision of governance or a vision of society in which arts have a really important role? And, you know, so do you have any sense of that, of like, or anything that they say about that in some of the documents you looked at?
Thank you. So I think maybe first, you asked the question first of like, you know, why does beauty matter more generally, right? And I think, you know, one conundrum or kind of, you know, puzzle that got me going early on in this research and motivated me early on in the research was, in some sense, a certain kind of rhetorical position that one kind of encounters sometimes in speaking with Buddhist practitioners, or with, you know, certainly I found this in talking to current members of Mindröling. And I should say, actually, Mindröling is very much alive and functioning and thriving as a monastic institution today. The monastery I showed you is in central Tibet. It's much quieter, but they have a major branch in India, in Dehradun, which is very, very active today. So
and also in Lhasa, they have a house in Lhasa, and they sell books and arts and stuff like that, right, on the Barkor. Yeah, on the
Barkor, that's right. Yeah, so they're very much, you know, just because my book is about the early history, I don't want to give the impression that this is a thing of the past, right?
Oh, yeah.
But Mindröling, I would say, so in terms of beauty, I certainly heard from Mindröling Khenpos and people that I interviewed that, oh, well, you know, they were concerned about me getting overly focused on beauty, right? Because, you know, everybody would say, and I heard this not only from Buddhists, but also even sort of some, you know, I read in catalogs of Buddhist art, a certain kind of rhetoric of saying that, that really beauty doesn't matter, that it's not the point, you know, that what matters is that, that images be created correctly, you know, that they have to be, you know, done according to, you know, everything, the measurements should be, yeah, the iconography should be correct. And that's what mattered. And oh, if it was beauty, that was just a kind of, if there was beauty, it was a side, it was a kind of byproduct. And, you know, I mean, I think in some sense I wasn't satisfied with that. And it was in some ways what kind of initially drove me, right? And so I think, you know, if we think about things like, for instance, depictions of the Buddha, of the historical Buddha, we can see much beyond Mindröling, as Janet's saying, and much beyond Tibetan Buddhism. You know, there is a focus on beauty, right? Physical beauty is often associated with virtue, with clarity, with eloquence. We see these things elided very, very often, you know, particularly in whether the visual images or the verbal descriptions, you know, literary descriptions of figures like the historical Buddha, right? Whose beautiful, golden, glowing, gorgeous features. So there's something, you know, beauty is doing something there, right? And in that context, I think it often is correlated with virtue and with a sort of sense that this is a good person. So we see the same kind of depictions, as I said, of Terdak Lingpa, We see them of earlier ancestors, this kind of sense of this physical majesty and beauty. And so I think that early on, one of the kind of hinges for me was a sense that that beauty is also associated with effectiveness, ritual effectiveness, right? Because if it's correct, it may happen to be beautiful, but then it's also going to work. And also, as I said, on a personal level, with its associated or individual level, it's often associated with again, it is a certain kind of effectiveness, but with eloquence, with clarity, and with virtue, right? So I think there are those ways that beauty does signify a lot, even if it's problematic in terms of how it's framed as being, whether it's a central sort of concern in making Buddhist art.
And when you speak about correctness, the correct iconography, it's not even necessarily as opposed to beauty, because where does the whole notion of correct iconography come from? It's a certain sense of what are the best proportions, and so that's a kind of system by which you can create something beautiful. But the idea being is that the correct iconography is going to have an impact on the viewer, and the correct iconography of the Buddha and the actual impact of looking at the figure of the Buddha visually has on disciples and students in terms of learning the Dharma. So you can draw so many connections actually in Buddhism with some of these virtues themselves. So here's another question though, which is related to what we're talking about. And I'm just wondering, is it possible for you to go back to some of the slides that you were showing us and make them bigger? As you were sharing your screen, can you make it bigger and that we could see some of the detail? Because one of the things that strikes me is that these images, the high level of artistic competence and it's something that even if you have an untrained eye, you can see the grace and the precision, and these are extremely impressive figures. And so for example, in the painting of his brother Dharma Shri, so feel free to share your screen if you're able to do that. But Dharma Shri, his brother, was a great scholar, and he's the author of many, many volumes of all kinds of commentary and intellectual stuff. And you have to wonder, where did he learn to paint so well? And how long does it take to learn to paint that well? So, oh, good. So you can blow things up. So that's the image of him painted by someone else. Can you make it bigger?
I'm afraid let's see what happens. I don't want to make anyone dizzy if I go. That's it.
Oh, no, you can make us dizzy. Go ahead.
Okay.
Make us dizzy. Okay, and then just move it upward, just so you can see it. I mean, so this would have been painted after his life. So that's Dharma Shri, but it's showing him actually writing on a chalkboard. Can you go back to that?
Yes.
Him writing on a chalkboard. So it's picturing him as a scholar. So a chalkboard is what Tibetans use to write compositions and then they erase. It's like a notebook. And so it's showing him as a scholar, not as a painter. But if you show us one of the images that's attributed to him, and I also, I visited Mindröling with my husband in 2016, and we too were showed several of these images that are still on the wall. Okay, here's one. And this is an amazing one of, can you make that bigger?
Maybe.
So this is attributed to Dharma Shri. This is an image of his brother, and Dominique tells us that it was restored. And I think that you can see that probably the face and the hands look like they've been brightened up. But the wonderful, this is not a person who's just, randomly in his spare time, putting, this is a huge painting on a wall. This is done by this scholar. When did he get the time to study this? And here's my bigger question. Have you ever thought of what does Mindröling look like when you enter it? Like if you're walking in there during the time of Dharma Shri, are you seeing lots of craftspeople all over the place? Are there art classes? I mean, do you know how and where this kind of instruction would have taken place? So it's just like amazing to me, like, he's got to have studied for years to be able to do something this beautiful and this competent and this masterful.
Yeah, I think there's so much in what you're saying. I want to make sure I'm not muted. So one answer is yes, I've thought lots about what it looked like when you walked in the 17th and early 18th century, and you know, tried my best to sort of glean some of that from the sources that we have, many of which are very descriptive, right? As you start to ask these questions about what were they thinking about aesthetics? Did the senses and the cultivation of the senses matter? You see all these texts answering again and again that the answer is yes. And so I have some wonderful descriptions that I can show you in a couple of slides too. But I think going back to your question, a couple of questions ago about why would these monks at Mindröling, and you know, the main lamas, the throne holders, were not monks, but also were tantric practitioners who also could marry and had children, and this is how the family lineage works, of course. But many of the members of Mindröling, most of them by far, were monks. And you know, your question about why would they want people to be cultivated in this way, you know, I think does go back to kind of claims about these fields of knowledge, the Rikne. I'm just reading a quote that without becoming a scholar in the 5 sciences, not even the supreme sage can become omniscient, right? So this sense that Rikne, these fields of knowledge, are the basis of all knowledge. They're the basis of Buddhist knowledge. They're the basis of what leads to Buddhahood, to omniscience. And so I think in that way, it's easy to justify, right, that lay people too need these. And in some sense, it's more of a stretch to understand how it was justified for monks to spend their time, as you're saying, because it takes many years, right? It takes many years to become a really skilled poet in the tradition of ornate poetry. It becomes many years. And I think, Janet, that's a big part of the controversy, right? Is this a good way to spend your time? If you're a monk, especially, is it a good way to spend your time learning to compose ornate poetry,
Well, clearly it was, and clearly they answered in the affirmative, you know, and it's just amazing what they were able then to achieve. Can you show us also the image of Padmasambhava too? So that's the other one that's attributed to, yeah, that's a harder one. So, yeah.
It's hard behind the glass, yeah.
Right. How about the one of the Lama of the Nyo clan? That's an earlier one. So one of the other questions I wanted to ask you was about the you know, why at Mindröling? And you cite in your book this myth about the origins of the Nyo clan and about this. Can you blow that one up too, so we can see it much bigger, much bigger, more. Because it's a great slide, so it takes, okay, that's enough, yeah. But this myth says, you know, in the Tibetan region of Karak, the people had never before seen such an attractive and handsome figure. They're talking about the founder, the sort of humanoid founder of their clan. With strong, healthy limbs, he was a pleasure to look at. The bridge of his nose was high, his forehead was broad, his eyebrows were long, his features were distinguished. As for his skin, like the jasmine blossoms, it was white and smooth, making him nectar for the eyes.
Sorry, I lost the slide there.
Okay, yeah. You know, so in what ways have you thought about it? Is this region of Tibet perhaps, you know, or something, are there a lot of artisans in this region? Is there a strong artistic tendency that maybe the families of these guys were already propagating even before, you know, so are they drawing not only on Buddhist values, but they're juxtaposing them with already existing, you know, interest and predilection for the arts?
I think absolutely. I think they absolutely are drawing on earlier predilections for the arts. And I think especially when you look at the biographical material of the ancestors of Therak Lingpa and of Lutchen Dharmastri, and then later of their, you know, his daughter Mingyur Paldren, their ancestors, these members of the Nyo clan, and also on the mother's side, they're always quite specific about sort of their particular areas of expertise, you know, as painters or as you know, experts in astrology. But all of these fields of Rikne, many of which are artistic or poetics, there is a very strong sense that this is a kind of a pride of, an element of pride in the identity of the lineage, right? Is that there is this sort of sense of being, maybe for lack of a better word, for being cultured in these ways. And so I think it is a much longer history than just Mindröling, for sure.
Yeah, and so this image we're looking at, right, is a lama from the clan, an earlier, so from like when, the 14th, 13th century.
Yeah.
13th century, and you see just how beautiful it is, and how, this is an area not often thought of as a place of high culture, where there's institutions, like, so you see images of this kind of, height of achievement in mainland China and so on, out in the wilds of Tibet, that people are able to produce at this level of sophistication, just the expression on his face and the level of, beautiful detail and so on. It's really, really astonishing, really striking.
Yes, I mean, I think that in some sense, there is a kind of, the underlying, one of the underlying messages in the book is just to pay attention, I guess, to pay closer attention to the cultural production of monasteries like this. And as you said, it's not that Mindröling is a unique case by any means. I mean, I think it's a kind of extreme case of this concentration of focus on Rikne and the arts, of this particular kind of concentration on what I'm calling aesthetic education. Which is not something that they explicitly, mark as what they're after, right? It's more that something that I'm kind of, that's my interpretive framework that I'm applying.
Right. But if you speak to people today, and, I mean, I can just cite, I was fortunate to know Mr. Shakabat, Sepon Shakaba, before he passed away, who was a member of the aristocracy in Lhasa before the Chinese takeover, and fled around the time of the Dalai Lama, and was a high member of the government. And he himself was raised, and studied at Mindröling, and had, a very powerful memory of its, impact on his own formation as a person, and Shakaba, of course, is like a famous historian who's, and writes very, very well and so on. So, it really did function in this way. It was like actually very successful, which is really,
And as you say, until the 50s, right? Until the 1950s, not only did some aristocrats lay people go to Mindröling, I think, to be fair, it was always a relatively small number, and it seems to have been mostly members of the sort of very most prestigious families. But the Mindröling monks did also go to Lhasa, to the main schools for aristocrats, and worked as teachers there, right? So,
really?
Yeah, in the same way, the ritual traditions that were kind of crystallized and codified at Mindröling spread to other Nyingma monasteries, right? In many cases, a kind of whole adaptation. And in the same way, the model of the Mindröling literary arts teaching was established then at these aristocratic schools in Lhasa. So
how do you know about that? So you mean that, what do you mean by aristocratic schools in Lhasa? Where were they, and how do you know about those?
So the main schools that I'm talking about, I think, were like in right at the base of the Potala, right? And
In Sure?
Yeah, exactly, in Sure. And they, or I know of two in particular. Of course, Pema Boom, who I hope is here somewhere, was the first to connect me with some of these sources about the what was taught at those schools. And so up until the 50s, it was still based on a Mindröling kind of model. I also have heard from so many people when I talk to them about the history of Mindröling and beyond Lhasa. This is the other thing too, in Eastern Tibet as well. People saying, oh yes, so-and-so, this Lama from this place, this monastery, they all went to Mindröling for various periods of training. So it carried this from its conception, in the 17th century all the way up until, of course, things changed so much in the 50s. But that sort of sense of Mindröling being a center for this kind of education. But at the same time, right, I don't want to allow this unusual aspect of Mindröling, which is the kind of, or this extraordinary aspect of Mindröling, which led to the training in literary arts being so significant, to overshadow that, of course, still it was really a main center for great perfection practice, for ritual practice, for actually monastic discipline. So part of what's so fascinating to me about it is the ways that it integrated these various factors.
Yeah,
Which,
and you know, one of the things about that, just to interrupt you for a second, you know, it's not hardly surprising, you know, then the Dzogchen tradition and Tibetan tantric tradition in general is very much about visionary practice, about, you know, having visionary experiences. And so it's already engaged in a highly visualized kind of sort of template of ways of spiritual cultivation through seeing, through vision per se, you know, and so, and also, by the way, just that other image that you showed us of the letter which was a beautiful, fantastically beautiful image. But, you know, the practices of Dzogchen are about how to cultivate, you know, almost these hallucinatory visions and get them really clear and to be able to see them very, very well and so on. You know, there's an obvious connection there between Buddhist practice and you know, something that then could translate also into secular arts, so to speak. So that really makes a lot of sense as well.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think more and more I'm just becoming really interested and curious about how these, you know, how paying attention to, you know, sort of documents of the senses can allow us certain kinds of entry into what might be more of a kind of phenomenological, you know, sort of sense of the experience of these different kinds of practice.
Yeah, reconstructing or constructing experience, not only through logic and rational processes, but through other kinds of, sensory practices. It's, you know, highly, highly fascinating and interesting thing. You were going to say something more about dream yoga. Was that something that you wanted to add, or just that you?
I hoped so. Yeah, just that I would say that I'm afraid to move around in these slides now because I don't want to make us go all over. Let me see if I can go back out now. Hold on a sec. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Okay, so yes, I'll show you that. Yeah, so again, I think part of the reason I want to talk about it is I'm sort of now beginning to work on dreams again. And so in a new project that I'm working on, sort of dreams keep kind of reasserting themselves as an interest of mine. But yeah, in a certain way, this is so important to me because it was really what drew me to Mindröling. You know, I don't know if anyone has ever encountered the Minling Trichen, most recent, who passed away, I think in 2007 or 8. He was famous for dream yoga, and also, I mean, early on, some of the kind of stories that drew me to the monastery were that, you know, he was always sleeping, right, because his practice during the dream state. So it was like, well, do you want
to do that practice all the time?
But it was, you know, the significant. But one of the things that is interesting is his Tarduk Lingpa's mother is also recorded to have been a great practitioner of this. So again, the ways that aspects of Mindröling which stand out and add to its prestige. I mean, one of the things that about whether it's about Dzogchen or about this sort of presence of women teachers is that many of them point back to a certain kind of status, right, of prestige that the Mindröling, that the tradition has carried with it, because it's known for excellence in ritual traditions, because it was known for Rigne, for particularly literary arts and medicine, because it was known for this sort of expertise in great perfection in ritual. There was a kind of aura, right, of prestige that has, I think, really fascinatingly continued, right? And I think in a certain sense, dream yoga has that sort of, you know, has an element of that as well. So I was hoping to just mention that his mother was also known as an expert in that.
This particular image, I mean, it's just a small image. These are like these small cards that they use in initiation rituals to show to the participants. But you just see the amount of energy, like even in the leaves below the petals of the lotus. I mean, there's so much confidence and kind of like, you know, the letter and with this rainbow around it. It's just like gorgeous, you know, it's really stunning. So I think we can start to take some of the audience's questions. I think.
Great. We have, you can hear me now, I think, right? Okay. We have students here. So some of the students in the room now are taking my survey of Tibetan literature class. And we've read Tale of the Incomparable Prince, so they're familiar with Dokar Tsering Wangyal. They also read and loved Dispute between T and Chang and other writers. So I thought there are a couple of students have questions here, and then to remind, people who are online, you can write your questions in the Q&A. They won't be viewable by all, but we will field them to Dominique and to Janet. Maybe we'll start. John, did you want to come up? I'm going to have them come up to the microphone so you can actually engage them directly. Okay.
Hi, Professor Townsend. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation the significance of the fifth Dalai Lama sponsoring a monastery that belonged to a different sect. And I was wondering if you could kind of go or maybe explain in greater detail the importance of that kind of sectarian sponsorship. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great question. Yeah, so this period of time, certainly in the Lhasa region, which is the focus, for my book, so I'll just kind of keep it there for the moment. There was a great deal of shifting power, vying for power on various fronts, right? And so there was a fair amount of out and out sort of repression between the various sects. And this is much more, it has a much longer history than just this early modern period. The history of Tibet, there has always been a sort of shifting power base, and different schools have come to the forefront, and especially through alliances with political and military forces, have come in and out of the sort of center stage in terms of having political power. We can, this is sort of in certain ways one of the ways that we could tell the history of Buddhism in Tibet. So during this period, the fifth Dalai Lama, of course, with the support of the Kushok Mongols, had become this sort of king, this figure who had joint political and religious authority, and who really, with the support of his kind of main crew of advisors and regents, really sought to, again, extend this sort of vision of an imperial Tibet, right? The model based on the much earlier history. And so with that, there was a kind of a very strong sense of the Gelug, his school's dominance as well. And so there was a significant persecution of other, religious and Buddhist traditions during this time. And so and actually, I should say, I sort of somehow failed to mention that the way that the book closes is in the epilogue. I write very briefly about a terrible period of violence against Mindröling, which took place very early in its history in 1717. Dzungar Mongol troops came and essentially assassinated the main figure, so the Chandramasri, the son of Terdak Lingpa, who was himself a monk, Pemigirmi Gyatso. These people were murdered, and the monastery was essentially destroyed. And those people who could, fled into exile. And so this was after the death of the Dalai Lama, the fifth Dalai Lama. But I think it was in many ways a sort of expression of sectarian violence, right? The Dzungars were supporters of the Gelug school. And, I think in certain ways it was somewhat more subtle than that as well. It had to do with a doubt, a fear of the old school or the Nyingma school as being corruptible, but even more generally, I think in certain ways, a kind of fear of tantric practice and tantric expertise.
Right. And it was also the political, so it's association with the Ganden Podrang, so it's association with political power that comes from the Dalai Lama. It's partially, you could say it's partially sectarian, but a lot of it is very political. So just because of the political connection of Mindröling with the aristocrats and with the Potala Palace. But the Dalai Lama himself, I mean, if you look at the output of all the works that the Dalai Lama himself produced, for one thing, he's very famous for his so-called secret autobiography, his visionary autobiography that's been written about a lot by Samden Karme. I mean, he was a practitioner of Dzogchen. So, for him, the kind of Gelugpa Nyingma thing was not like a big issue. Sometimes we make a lot of this, it's all about sectarianism. Often it's really just political affiliation, but then people felt quite free to make use of the whole range of the gamut of Tibetan Buddhist practices that are available. And someone like the Dalai Lama is a highly intelligent, highly educated person, was just fascinated by actually the practice of Dzogchen. And he wanted not to be limited by his Gelugpa background, although, again, calling it Gelugpa, may not be the right word. It's his monastic, the kind of training he would have gotten in the monastery, and then the more expansive, into the arts, as we're seeing, is something that happens at Mindröling. So again, like pigeonholing everything as like sectarian, oh, here we have one sect and another. I think we don't go very far in understanding Tibetan Buddhism if we're saying, oh, he's of this sect and this guy's of that sect. What's more interesting is that you have a vision of rulership that has access to the world of dreams, that has access to the world of visions, and they're going to use whatever practices are out there for them to, and so that's what Mindröling in many ways represents,
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's right.
Hi. So my question is, are there any instances of lay aristocrats who became monks while they were studying at Mindröling, just because of exposure, being around, because obviously they were studying together. It wasn't like they were isolated. Like, was there any back and forth in terms of that, of people switching roles or inhabiting different roles simultaneously?
Great question. So actually, I think that they probably were fairly separate. Not completely separate, but I think that the aristocrats really were there in a kind of role of being directly tutored by, the very top kind of educators at Mindröling. So we should see this. It was a really quite elite kind of set of people there for the most part. Yeah, and it would have been kind of a private. That's right. They would have taken part in some of the ritual activities, but for the most part, it would have been like private tutoring. So they were somewhat separate, but actually there's a really interesting story of that kind of lay ordained tension, actually in the story of the son of Terdag Lingpa, his eldest son, who was meant to be his successor. But according to the Mindröling tradition, the main, when this was established in the vision of the monastery, that the main throne holder, the main figure, the head of the monastery should not be ordained, should be a tantric expert who was would also marry and have children, and was in other ways was not ordained in any case. And but his son, Pemigir Gyatso, actually chose to become ordained. And this was very much against the expectations and wishes of the family. He cut his hair, which was which was in many ways a kind of breach of expectations. And I've seen a few accounts that even suggested that it was because he did that, because he went against the expectations and became a monk, that sometimes that's been used as a sort of a framework for why the monastery was so unlucky as to be targeted by the Dzungars, right? So in a certain sense, although there was actually such a strong sense on monastic decorum, on monastic rules, on really the monks being the best of the best, I think anxieties about other kinds of tantric practice at Mindröling, that he was so persuaded by that, it seems, that he wanted to be a monk, but in that case, that was quite problematic for other reasons, right? That wasn't what was expected of him at the monastery.
That's really interesting.
Hi, Professor Townsend and Professor Gyatso. I have a very minor question about the use of cosmopolitanism in the book. As I understand, it's unique for Mindröling as an institute that cultivates this mentality. But I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on how applicable is this notion of cosmopolitanism is for other, religious and historical Tibet.
Thank you. Great question too. Yeah. I really moved in various directions on this term. And at one point it was in the title. I think it was in the title of my dissertation. And in a lot of ways, actually, my interest in the framework of cosmopolitanism which I do think the term works in many ways, right, for Mindröling. But I also had certain kinds of, had some hesitancy about its effectiveness, right, in the argument, which is sort of in certain ways why it has receded from the foreground. But I think that, certainly there was a period where there's a sense of Mindröling being interested in Indic, tradition, in philosophy, in the sort of architecture. Mindröling is described as being like Samye in the sense that its architecture has, Indic and Chinese and Tibetan elements, the same as Samye does. There's a strong sense of, in the text that I'm looking at, a sort of sense of awareness of neighbors and engagement with Nepalis, with, of course, all different kinds of Mongol neighbors, with the Qing, of course. And so, this sort of, and with Italian Jesuit missionaries in Lhasa, right? There's evidence of exchange there between Lochen Dharmashri and Tarak Lingpa and those missionaries. And in fact, one question I've always had about that image that Janet has a great photo of that I showed you, with the glasses on the head, was whether, actually around this time, I think, was when they developed the first eyeglasses in Italy. And I sort of always, it's not a theory because I was never able to find any evidence, but I always wondered whether there was some, whether in fact he did have some kind of early eyeglasses. I don't know, I was never able to kind of really firmly land on that. But there are, there's evidence, of course, when we think about cosmopolitanism, a kind of interaction of distinct cultures in a harmonious way. I think that all of that is very significant here, for sure. I also actually think that the way that the Mindröling authors treat this concept of Rime, which is often translated again as non-sectarianism, but which, there's, we've had ongoing long discussions about whether non-sectarianism is the best translation for that term. And I would say certainly in the case of Mindröling, it's not the right translation for the term. And what I'm wondering is if in a certain way, the attitude of Rime as this sort of boundarylessness, as this sort of refusal of a fixed perspective, can be understood. I'm not saying a translation of cosmopolitan, but as a sort of moral or ethical cosmopolitanism of being a kind of open to other perspectives, radically open to other perspectives, and radically valuing other perspectives. So it's all of those things that I want to get at with cosmopolitanism, but I wish I could talk with you more, the student who asked that question, because I'd be so curious to know your particular hesitations, but maybe you can email me. But I like the way you're thinking, and I'm glad that you raised that. I think there's lots to be said about that framework. I don't know, what do you think, Janet?
I mean, no, I totally agree. And I think that's a great answer. And what you said about Rime is also appropriate. But I think I would just repeat what I was trying to say before, is that I think many of the things you're showing us about Mindröling are not unique to Mindröling. It's just Mindröling was especially well developed, but many of these things would be true of many of the other great monastic centers. And again, not even only in Tibet, but in the Buddhist world more generally. Buddhism is a tradition that has a lot of moving parts, a lot of moving people, a lot of people coming through, a lot of people visiting. It's very self-consciously international, and it's very self-consciously, dealing in this way. And of course, it's more or less true of different institutions. Some are more, some are less. But I would agree with the use of the term. But maybe if the student would like to respond and say, if you have any hesitations about the use of the term, but I would use the word for other Buddhist monasteries as well, many of them in history.
We'll move on to our next question, but yeah, the student is appreciating the discussion so far.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for this great conversation. I have a question about women. So I understand that, there were prominent, or at least one prominent woman in the high leading founding figures of the monastery. But does this trend somehow continue or found resonances afterwards in education of women or cultivation of arts and other fields of knowledge among women, like among nuns maybe? Was there a nunnery attached? And then among lay women, I guess when we are speaking about lay aristocrats here, we speak only about lay men, and maybe also some kind of more prominent well, even among the aristocratic men, more prominent men, and maybe those chosen by their families to then become bureaucrats or engage with the state somehow. Thank you.
Thank you. Great, wonderful. So let's see where to start. Yes, there was a small community of nuns attached to Mindröling from the beginning, it seems, called Samtense, and it was a small sort of retreat center, usually had about 30 nuns there. And yes, the women who were, so again, when I first encountered Mindröling, I heard again and again, oh, you know, there are all these women teachers at Mindröling, there are all these great women teachers. So not just in this early period that I'm looking at, whereas you've seen there's Terdak Lingpa's daughter, this is Terdak Lingpa. Terdak Lingpa's daughter, Mingir Peldrin, was a very important figure, as I've mentioned. His mother was a very important figure. So in this early period, at least two really significant women actors who were, you know, not by any means in supporting roles, right? Really very, very major, you know, players in the early history of Mindröling. But your question is an excellent one for many reasons. One is that the more I looked, the more I realized that the women who were educated at Mindröling were all, as far as I can tell, are mostly members of the family, right? So again, remembering that this is a family lineage at Mindröling, you can think of it as sort of like a monarchy in terms of its model, right? It passes from parent to child and from, in a certain way, from uncle to nephew on the side of the sort of abbot of the monastery. So it moves through the family. And so as you can imagine, in a family lineage, you have to pay attention to the women, right? It may be patriarchal, but you need those women. And so, you know, along with that also is this sort of sense of the prestige of the family. It's a cultured, educated family. And so to a certain extent, the women were also educated. I don't want to go too far in sort of downplaying the kind of more inclusive view at Mindröling, but I have to say, almost to my disappointment, as I spent more time with the sources, it's not as if I saw, oh, this real deep sense of kind of gender equality or something like that, but rather, you know, as we can see in other, you know, early modern societies or pre-modern societies, that oftentimes in, you know, pockets where women are getting really good education, it's almost always because of socioeconomic class. And so that seems to be the case at Mindröling. The women who are educated were members of the family. So there's a class aspect there too. But they did many of those, but it did last, right? It's a family lineage that continued and continues to the present day. There are the current generation of Mindröling teachers. There's Khandro Rinpoche, who's a major teacher, and also her sister, her younger sister, who's more of a lower profile, but is a really excellent historian, scholar, translator. So yes, it did continue.
Yeah, Khandro is really would be an important person to point to, who's a major teacher. And she's a relatively young woman still and stuff.
We have a related question from Ryan Jacobson or Jakobson, just recently at University of Oxford. They ask, I'm curious about the biography of Terdak Lingpa's mother, composed by his brother Lochen Dharma Shri. Tibetan biography, hagiography, and life writing has been a point of interest, especially with recent publications and conferences. Did his mother have any connection to Mindröling or presence in Terdak Lingpa's life? Also, could you please share the screen with the title of the work and possibly share the collection in which the text is located? Thank you.
Sure. Where is that? Okay, here it is. Yes, thanks so much. So yes, his mother was a fascinating figure. This is, unfortunately, only a partial biography. There are at least a few folia missing. I'm not sure how many, but it isn't a complete biography. What we can see, though, is a very well-developed main character here. She's really fascinating, very kind of three-dimensionally depicted by her son, right, as somebody who was herself a very significant patron of the arts and of Buddhism, who was herself a very significant practitioner of Dzogchen or great perfection practices, as I already mentioned, who was really a main advisor to her son, to Terdak Lingpa, as he entered into his career as a visionary. So she was very, very significant. One thing I would say too about almost all the sources that I've cited in the book, we're so lucky to have BDRC now. It's TBRC, BDRC. So many of these things are available to you if you have access. So this is in the Sumbum, the collected works of Lochen Dharmasri, easily accessible.
Okay, and one of our students wrote in the Q&A. It's a good question here. She asks, I read recently about some Buddhist art in the Goryeo. I don't know if I have that right. Goryeo period in Korea, in which beautiful, intricate images were also present. It was said that at this time, making Buddhist art in such a complex fashion was considered an act of devotion in and of itself. Do you think this could possibly be a contributing factor to the intricacy of Buddhist art in Tibet, as we see here based on your readings? We have just a few minutes left, so I thought that also relates to a question I would ask about just sort of, was there a larger project going on? When we read our literature, there was the motivation of relaying moral values, for example, and yet entertainment. Here we have devotion. I'm also wondering if there's a sort of an intersection between, if you could talk a little bit more about class, possibly as a motivation, or what is the bigger project, and then especially this question about devotion. Thank you.
Sure, I'll start just by saying that I think absolutely that devotion to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and to deities and to lamas and to great practitioners is always there as a kind of huge motivating force and justification for offerings. And so if we think of these ritual arts as being kind of motivated by a sort of, that basic kind of motivation of making offerings as an act of devotion, I think that works as a really useful kind of framework for understanding why it's okay to spend your time on these things too, right? That there's a sort of sense that these are offerings, and that, offerings the same way when you have a guest who you want to offer, some beautiful, things to eat and drink. In the same way, there's this sort of sense of the ritual arts being motivated by a sense of devotion and offering. So I think that's absolutely significant here. Jenna, do you want to say anything?
No, I think that's good. A great answer.
Okay. And then I guess in terms of class, I know we're almost out of time. I think this is such an important topic and question. I think the role of the sort of ruling class families in a lot of monastic networks, I think, is something that is really ripe for more research. And I think the ways that socioeconomic class, shaped, of course, opportunities, access to monasteries, to resources, to teachers, is not at all simple. It may not be exactly what we expect. I don't want to give the impression that it's just the sort of, most predictable, grim picture that, the ruling class got access to everything and nobody else got anything, because I think it's actually much more complex than that. I see in the Mindröling documents that I spend time with, that there is a sense that there are monks there who are not from wealthy families. There is a mix of socioeconomic class in the monastic population. But I do think class is a really important framework for us to think with.
Great. I think we're out of time, unfortunately. Any last comment, Dominique or Janet, would you like to say in closing?
I would just say thank you so much. Thank you for organizing and for having us. And thanks to everyone who is there, both in person in the Weatherhead Institute, and then who joined online. I'm so grateful for your attention, and so grateful to Janet for your great questions and your presence here. Thank you.
We're definitely grateful to you both. This was an exciting, really interesting discussion. And Dominique, you reminded me to thank our sponsors. Co-sponsors were Weatherhead East Asian Institute and the CV Star East Asian Library. And then I've added in the chat here a link to our upcoming events for the Modern Tibetan Studies program. And again, thanks to you all and to students here for your good questions.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. Bye, everybody. Thank you for
Bye-bye.